Well, good afternoon, everybody. I don't know if you can see me or not, but this is Alexa Purdy from the Colorado Coalition Against Sexual Assault office in Denver. It's a little bit of a rainy day, so I hope you all are staying warm and dry out there. I don't know what the conditions are across Colorado, but I welcome you to today's webinar looking at the intersection of disability and sexual assault. I am particularly excited about this presentation because I think that this is an underrepresented issue within the sexual violence response and prevention field. So I'm really happy to have Jean with us here today. Jean also represents one of our new programs, which is the Regional Training and Assistance Program through CCASA, affectionately known as RTAP, another acronym for you to remember. But RTAP is a great new regional program that is designed to allow you to have access on the ground in your communities at your agencies to regional specialists specifically trained by CCASA to provide training, resources, consultation, and support to member agencies across Colorado. So I really hope that if you haven't looked into the RTAP program yet, that you do consider that. It's free training and consultation for CCASA members. So I'm really excited to be able to talk to you about RTAP and let you see the expertise that we have within it today here with Jean. A real quick bit of business before we get started. If you have questions for Jean throughout the webinar, please do type those into your question/chat box, and Jean will take some time about halfway through her webinar and then at the end to look at those questions and to address them for you. And also, a lot of times people have the question about, do I just ask questions, do I type questions? So you are automatically muted, so please just type those in, and we will provide you with an email after the webinar today that'll go into providing you with the PowerPoint and any other materials from today's presentation. So please do look for that in your email after today's webinar. So one of the things that we're going to do throughout the webinar today is to have poll questions. So I'm going to start with our first poll question, and this is one that we usually start with, and we just want to ask, who is on today's webinar? So you can click directly on your screen. Are you a community-based confidential advocate? Are you a disability advocate? Are you somebody who works for the police, or are you someone that works for a prosecution office? Are you a sexual assault nurse examiner? I know a lot of folks might go into that other category. If you're in that other category, go ahead and type into your question/chat box the profession that you represent. And then I can read those off and we can get a better idea of who is in the room. So I'm looking at that right now. It looks like we have some folks from universities, therapists, campus advocates. Go ahead and keep typing those in if you fall into that other category. More folks identify as therapists, domestic violence case manager. We have somebody who is a SART coordinator, a foster child advocate, a CASA advocate, not to be mistaken for CCASA, a CASA-coordinated special advocate, someone who identifies as an advocate, another SART coordinator. Lots of folks on the webinar today. It looks like about 86% of you, to be exact, have responded. So if you haven't yet, go ahead and click on your screen, and I'll be closing the poll in just another second. It looks like another person responded in the other category, Community College Title IX Investigator. Welcome. Okay, so let's close, and then I'm going to share it with you because I think you might be surprised. We have primarily community-based confidential sexual assault advocates. So welcome to everybody to today's webinar. We're really excited to have you. And if you do have questions for Jean, as I said, go ahead and type those into the questions/chat box throughout the webinar today. And I'm going to actually hand it over to Jean. Let me do that here. Jean, are you with us?
I am. Thank you so much, Alexa. Welcome, everyone. I am delighted to be here and am delighted to really kind of launch my efforts as a regional specialist for CCASA. We have a number of things that we want to get done today, but the next slide here, I think one of the first things I'd like to address is the notion that a lot of us don't see people with disabilities in our organizations, but I think what I'd like you to think about is that if you don't, I'd like you to question that, and we'll talk a little bit about that more. And also, I'd like to let you know that you should. The statistics on the slide in front of you really are staggering. The research shows that 83% of women with developmental disabilities will be sexually assaulted in their lifetime, and of that number, more than half will experience sexual assault 10 or more times. So we're talking about people who are targeted and who are repeatedly targeted. We'll talk about the vulnerability today and really why some of the factors that contribute to that vulnerability. As we look at people with disabilities in general, 51 million Americans live with disability, and consequently they constitute the largest minority group in the United States. As a group, aggregately, they tend to be less educated and less employed. People with crimes against people with disabilities statistically are more likely to be against the person than against property. In other words, they're physical crimes such as sexual assault rather than fraud and other crimes more against property. So March is National Developmental Disabilities Awareness Month. Thus, this webinar strategically planned during that month. We're going to really look at answering 4 specific questions, providing you information so that you hopefully will have a beginning of an answer to these questions. The first of those, what are intellectual and developmental disabilities? What's the difference, etc. Secondly, we'll look at those staggering numbers, that 83% of women with developmental disabilities are sexually assaulted in their lifetimes. And again, for half of those, it's 10 or more times. Why are those numbers as staggering as they are? What difference does disability matter in our organizations? And we'll talk a little bit about accommodations and communication there. And then there's traditionally there is a distinct difference between clients with disabilities, intellectual developmental disabilities, and those without. And that difference really can help us respond to and better serve them when we encounter them as victims of sexual assault. So a lot to get done in the course of our hour. Again, I'm glad you are here with us, and let's get started. We have a second poll that I'd like to just kind of get a little bit of information from you on. And that has to do with what is the difference between an intellectual and a developmental disability. So what do you think that is? We'll talk about it, but option 1, developmental disability is an umbrella term that includes intellectual disability. Option 2, intellectual disability is an umbrella term that includes developmental disability. And option 3, you don't think there is a difference. Intellectual disability, developmental disability are really the same kinds of disabilities. So I'll give you just a couple minutes to respond. And it looks as if the vast majority of you, about 9 out of 10 respondents or so, looks to give everybody 63% of us have voted. If the rest of you could finish your voting, that would be great. We'll close the poll here in just a minute or two. And it appears as if the vast majority of people, okay, we can maybe close that poll, and the results are about 81% of us voted, and the majority of us thought, number 1, developmental disability is an umbrella term that includes intellectual disability, and that is the correct answer. So we'll look more specifically then at that difference between intellectual and developmental disabilities. And in doing so, let's first look at, I apologize here, talk about what a developmental disability is. And it's a cognitive disability, something that affects thinking and brain function, or a physical disability, or it could be both of those. In the state of Colorado, a developmental disability is defined as one that occurs before age 22. If some of you have come from different states, that age limit may vary, but here in Colorado, the age limit is, it occurs before age 22, so you have to be 21 or younger, have that cognitive or physical or disability or both. Another characteristic of a developmental disability is that it is likely to continue indefinitely. In other words, it's something that, unlike, for instance, a mental illness that may be treated and that you may see some relief from the symptoms of, an intellectual or developmental disability will continue indefinitely. And there is also the last characteristic of a developmental disability listed on this slide is it accompanies with a substantial functional limitations in 3 or more areas of activities of daily living. So let's talk about what is an activity of daily living. Those are things like things you need to function typically in society: getting dressed, eating, discerning how to use transportation and using transportation, budget management, toileting, bathing, personal hygiene and grooming. So a developmental disability is one that presents with substantial functional limitations in 3 or more of those areas. Further, a developmental disability can affect a person's ability to comprehend, remember, or discern. And really the important thing here to remember about developmental disabilities is that folks who have those disabilities have a reduced ability to learn, not an inability. And that's where those accommodations and supports come in. It's a reduced ability, not an inability, with a developmental disability. Perhaps the most common developmental disability, or most frequently talked about developmental disability that many of us have heard about, is autism spectrum disorders. I know Time magazine, gosh, sometime within the past year, had a cover story on autism. It's kind of the developmental disability du jour. We're hearing a lot more about it. The graphic on this slide shows that spectrum, and but autism, important things to know about autism is that it is a developmental disability, so it really affects the way an individual develops, and develops both cognitively and physically. Specifically, autism affects verbal and nonverbal communication and social interaction. And it represents, as this graphic shows, a range of abilities from high to lower. And you see Asperger's on that spectrum there with that umbrella. And the next slide talks a little bit about autism may be called Asperger's. And Asperger's tends to be the higher functioning spectrum disorder, and folks with autism may have a heightened response to unstructured or routine situations. Folks with autism function pretty well when things are routine, and when that structure is broken, they become extremely uncomfortable. Talking a little bit about Asperger's, typically folks with Asperger's syndrome do not have the language delays that you see folks on the lower end of autism spectrum. They tend to be mildly affected And typically folks with Asperger's would have good language and cognitive skills. It would be more that response to an unstructured situation or perhaps social interactions that you would see what we wouldn't consider typical behavior. This slide has got a photograph of a famous Coloradan who lives with Asperger's in particular, but talks frequently about her autism. And this is Temple Grandin. She is on the faculty at Colorado State University, is best known for coming up with a method for cattle processors, meat packing industry, to more humanely and efficiently, and that's an important combination, process cattle. So she very eloquently talks about her autism. Again, having Asperger's, she doesn't have the language delays, but talks a lot about her how uncomfortable she is in social situations. She doesn't understand social cues, doesn't know how to read social cues. And again, those are very typical characteristics with Asperger's. Important to remember about autism, autism is not mental retardation, and it is not a mental illness. It's a developmental disability, a little bit different than those. Other developmental disabilities in addition to autism are things like Rett syndrome, cerebral palsy, and just other intellectual disabilities. Mental retardation we'll talk about here in just a moment when we shift to intellectual disability. I really liked this graphic for this slide because, as most of you identified in that poll question, an intellectual disability would be represented on this slide by the circle that's the letter A, which is really a subset of what I like to think is the circle B, which is a developmental disability. So an intellectual disability is really a kind of developmental disability. Intellectual disability clearly affects the way a child or adult has developed. Specifically, intellectual disability has limitations in both intellectual and adaptive behaviors. We talked a little bit earlier about what some of those adaptive behaviors are, and those are things that are more required for daily living, things like eating, feeding, interacting socially with other people, and so on. An intellectual disability occurs before age 21, used to be called mental retardation. We do not use that term anymore. We use intellectual disability. And the important thing, again, to remember for folks with all developmental disabilities, inclusive of intellectual disability, is that that's an impairment, not a complete incapacitation. So intellectual disabilities, or intelligence, if you will, really find folks impaired but not incapacitated. And that's real important to remember as we look to identify accommodations and other services and supports to help us work with them when they're victims of sexual assault. So I'd like to take a minute here and look at the questions that perhaps have been asked, and as to whether or not we have any questions about the differences between or what an intellectual or developmental disability is. And as you're typing those questions in, I think the other point I'd like to make here is Alexa mentioned that as a regional specialist, one of the things that I could do, if you think it would be helpful with your colleagues, organizations you work with or affiliated with, is come in and talk about the things we're talking about today. Obviously, an hour webinar, it allows us enough time to just scratch the surface. But for instance, the differences among or between intellectual and developmental disabilities, more information about what a developmental disability is. Those kinds of things would certainly be things that I would be happy to come in and talk with all of you about. And you know, that I'll have my contact information here at the end of the slide, or at the end of the presentation. But the any information on any of our goals that we're working on today in this webinar, clearly I'd be happy to do a presentation on in your organizations. So let's move on. I think some of those questions that have been asked we answered, and we'll move on to the next slide, which talks a little bit about those staggering numbers and why are people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, abbreviated here as IDD, targeted as much as they are. One reason is because they have less access to people with authority. The worlds of most folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities do not include opportunities for them to go to trainings and other places where they would typically interact with people in authority, such as law enforcement. And law enforcement is one example of people in authority, but it's also folks who are able to provide services and supports. Again, it's got to be their connections to those people are through a lot of us, their advocates and so on. So one of the reasons that people with intellectual and developmental disabilities are targeted is because they don't have access to people with authority, and perpetrators who target them recognize that and use that. In many cases, people with IDD are not perceived as credible, and even in speaking to their own victimization. Perpetrators know that of the challenges many times folks with IDD have in communicating. As a result, they know that folks who will take report and listen to their stories, whether those be on victimization or anything else, may question what it is they're saying. So that perception of folks with IDD as not being credible also increases their vulnerability and their victimization. So what difference does disability make in working with them, knowing whether or not a client has an intellectual or developmental disability? One way, and we'll talk a little bit about communication in a moment, but one way is the accommodations that we make in our agencies and as individuals ourselves for folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And I think both the graphic here and the list that the slide shows are helpful, and I encourage all of us to think about that a little bit. If a person comes into your office or into your organization, what's your typical intake process, and how does that accommodate somebody who has perhaps limited intellectual functioning? What vocabulary do you use and are on your intake forms? How much are you able to provide direction and support in that intake process? What does your office itself look like as far as the Americans with Disabilities Act requires, for instance, wheelchairs being able to fit through doors? Is your office completely able to accommodate folks who are in wheelchairs? If you're working with a client, for instance, with autism, it might be that buzz that oftentimes accompanies some lighting or a shiny object in the room or something that flashes would be distracting. So how is your office able to accommodate folks with intellectual developmental disabilities? Are you aware of how to access a disability advocate who can help you work with and provide services and supports for your client? And then what do you and the organization you work with for understand about that disability system? And we'll talk a little bit more about disability advocates, who they are, how you access them, and that disability system as we move through today's presentation. But one reason our knowing and understanding disability, why that matters, is because we're able to accommodate folks a little bit better. So I do have a poll that I would like to show if it's not too late. And that poll is continuing on here, looking at what difference does knowing that a client may have an intellectual or developmental disability matter. We talked about number one, it may impact the accommodations the client needs. Do you think number two, it may impact how you communicate with the client? Number three, there may be other resources to help you help the client. Or number four, all of the above. Or five, both accommodations and communication. If you take a moment and answer that poll, that would be great. And it looks as if everybody at this point has responded and recognizes that it really is all of those. Accommodations, communications, and resources. Thank you. Perfect. We'll go back to our slides now and continue on and talk a little bit about accommodations, and we'll talk about really now, we'll look to talk about communication. So if communication matters in how we work with a client who has an intellectual or developmental disability, how are you going to figure out whether or not a client has a disability to know that communication might matter? There are really, it's a problem because in many cases when you ask a person if they have a disability, they may say no because of the stigma that's attached with having a disability. Many folks grew up in a system, came out of public schools. They were perhaps isolated in special classrooms, special education classrooms, ILCs, and were known among their peers in school to be different. So they learn early on that there could be, in many cases when they interact with folks, a stigma attached with disability. So one of the things that we might want to do is look at disability acronym language. And we will be, as Alexis said, sending out this PowerPoint so you'll have access to these questions. But I would suggest that these are very good questions for you to ask. And if you get a yes to these questions, there's a high probability that the client you are working with has an intellectual or developmental disability. One of those questions is, do you have a case manager or a resource coordinator? The developmental disabilities system, which most folks will be part of, uses both case managers and resource coordinators. Folks know they have those people because those are the ones they call and interact with about services and supports, challenges they're facing, etc. So those are kind of buzzwords for them, case manager and resource coordinator. You might also ask if folks had an IEP. IEP is an individualized education plan, and the IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, that was passed 40 years ago this year and has been reauthorized since, allows for students in public schools with to have an individualized education plan. That's a plan that is developed to help meet identified needs and supports of each individual student. They need to qualify for that and have gone through a process, so they will know typically that they did have an IEP in school. And again, IEP, Individualized Education Plan. You might also ask them if they have an ISP. We all, as Alexa pointed out, have our own acronym language. People with disabilities, and the disability system is no different. So you could ask them if they have an ISP, an Individualized Service Plan, or if they work with an interdisciplinary team, an IDT. Again, these acronyms will be known to them because they are an important part of their lives. You could ask them if they work with a CCB, the Community Centered Board. We'll talk about that in those center boards in just a little bit, some more. You could ask them if they have Social Security income, if they get SSI. Everybody, for the most part, knows where their money comes from. Folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities, in most cases, are no different, and also know if they access or have SSI. And the last question you might consider asking them is, did you graduate from high school when you were 21? Part of the IDEA allows for students to perhaps graduate with their class at age 18, but remain in public schools and officially graduate, move on, transition from high school in the years between 18 and 21. So most kids with intellectual and developmental disabilities who have been part of a public school will do so through age 21. So that then is another good question. So these questions are great resources for you if you encounter a person that you're suspecting may have an intellectual or developmental disability. Just asking them any of these might help in your discernment with them. So what are ways to help you identify whether or not a person has an intellectual or developmental disability? And again, accommodate, alter your communication, and consider how your office space and intake process work is once you look at once you accommodate for cultural differences, and those are extremely important, obviously, is the client you're working with overly dependent on others? Do they seem to need other people for things that folks in a typical population wouldn't? Thinking about when to eat a meal, for instance, eating the meal or drinking, understanding how to use transportation. Does the client have difficulty communicating? Not just the level of vocabulary, but the vocabulary in general. And a third question that you might ask, again, after allowing for cultural differences, is you might ask yourself is, does the client have an inability to identify his or her needs? And again, that's where cultural differences are very important. Folks from different cultures won't know really what's typical in our culture for needs. But once you allow for those cultural differences, do you think the client is really unable to identify and give voice, meaning that, again, going back to that vocabulary and difficulty communicating to what he or she needs? Some other clues and cues that might help you identify whether a client has an intellectual or developmental disability is, do environmental stimuli seem overwhelming? For instance, I had one of our clients in my office the other day, and we're preparing for a special event, and I have, it's a silent auction of baskets, and the baskets are wrapped in shiny paper with ribbons. And the client who was on the autism spectrum had great difficulty focusing on the conversation he presumably came in my office to have with me because of the paper and the ribbons, and those environmental stimuli were a distraction. So that's another cue or clue that perhaps the person you're working with, the victim you're working with, might have an intellectual or developmental disability. Next, does the client have unconventional or what we wouldn't consider normal, typical in the general population, social behaviors? Eye contact would be a good one. Gestures, repeating questions that you ask, which is oftentimes known as echolalia. And both of these clues or suggestions here on this screen, I think, are particularly related to folks with autism. And again, our goal isn't to diagnose what disability a client may have. In fact, it's important for us not to do that, but rather to recognize the presence of disability and to recognize the need for additional services and supports. And as we continue on, talk a little bit about what some of those services and supports are available to help us help those clients. So if we recognize that we perhaps would be working with a client with an intellectual or developmental disability, what's important then to recognize is the need for us to alter our communication with that particular client. And it's extremely important to speak to the age the person is, not the age at which you think he or she functions. So in other words, if you're working with a client with an intellectual disability who, if you will, functions at the age of an elementary school student, you're not going to speak to that adult as if he or she is an elementary school student. You're going to speak to them as if they're an adult. You will alter, for instance, the vocabulary you use because the client has limited intellectual capacity. You will, for instance, perhaps not use compound and complex sentences because the client has an intellectual disability and rely more on simple sentences. So when we say speak to the age the person is, if the person is an adult, speak to them as if they are an adult rather than, for instance, if you think the person functions at age 3, you're not going to say, you wouldn't speak to them as, hi, how are you? We infantilize many times conversations with small children, and that's a behavior that we do not want to engage in when we're working with a client who's an adult. They are an adult, we speak to them as if they're an adult. If they're a child, we speak to them as if they're a child. And what you will see repeated on all of these slides is the importance of asking for understanding. Does the client understand what it is we talked about? And a way to ascertain that is this, as the graphic on this slide shows, is to ask the same questions 2 or 3 times in different ways. You can ask, where do you live? You could ask, do you live at? And then repeat what that person says. Again, one's an open-ended question, one is more relying on recall. So that level of cognitive functioning you'll need to remember. The difference between recall and recognition is very important. The second point here, do not praise between questions. The systems that folks with disabilities have grown up with, and those would be the education system and then the service delivery system, oftentimes reward folks for compliance. People with intellectual and developmental disabilities are often, have often, because of the environments they've come from, recognized that they don't get into trouble, that they don't cause problems if they do what they're told. So compliance is very important to them, typically. So when we praise by saying, oh yes, or nod, or things that oftentimes are meant to reassure, but can also be perceived as praising or encouraging, will then, because of that reliance on compliance, a victim with intellectual developmental disability may perceive it as praise and look to give you what he or she thinks you want and are responding to, rather than what would be honest answers to your questions. So just consider your response and try to not praise in between or in response to questions. And again, as we've talked about, make sure you are asking folks for understanding. These tips on communicating obviously are complicated and are just kind of the tip of the iceberg. If you think it would be helpful to talk about these more, we can do that. We can do that one-on-one. As I mentioned, I'm happy to come in to work with your staff over a brown bag lunch or something on any of these issues. Communication would be one. This slide speaks to using daily activities as a reference. Many times folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities aren't aware that they're eating breakfast at 9 o'clock, but they know that they eat breakfast before they go to work. So when we ask them, what did you do at 9 o'clock in the morning, or where were you at 9 o'clock in the morning, or what do you typically do before lunch, they may need to start with the first thing they do in the morning. We have a client who, when she calls the office, I will ask her how she is and what she's going to do today. For instance, I'll say, hey, let's say her name is Alexa. Hey, Alexa, how are you today? What are you going to be doing? And she'll say, well, I got up. After I got up, I went into the bathroom. I brushed my teeth. And if I choose to interrupt her and say, no, 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 I was wondering what you're doing after we're hanging up the phone, she will say, I got up when the alarm went off. I went into the bathroom. She can speak to her schedule, but what she needs to do is start at the beginning of that schedule. And again, it's not time related, it's more related to the activities that surround a typical day for her, which are often very routine days. So we've talked a little bit about the difference between intellectual developmental disabilities. We've talked about that targeting of people with disabilities and what difference disability matters from the perspective of making sure our offices and our systems for intake, for instance, and response are able to accommodate, and that we can communicate with folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities. But another important thing to remember, and that last question that we wanted to address today, is what kinds of services and supports exist for people, and it's really those services and supports that makes our working with them as victims of sexual assault very different. So the difference between folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities is that as adults, they will typically be associated with the state-funded system to provide them services and supports. They will have a case manager. You remember one of the yes questions to help us determine whether or not a client may have a disability is you can ask them if they have a resource coordinator or a case manager. Currently, those case managers are part of that state-funded system that provides services and supports, and that state-funded system really are community-centered boards. You may remember that that too was one of the questions. So as this graphic shows, if you look at all those balls as being victims of sexual assault, the difference from and that light blue ball representing a client, a victim with an intellectual and developmental disability, is that they will most likely, if the victim is an adult, be part of a state-funded system that can work with you, who's responding to them as a victim or survivor of sexual assault, to help address other needs in their life that may be exacerbating or complicating their victimization. And things like housing, things like transportation to and from, for instance, counseling, those kinds of things. So it's important to know a little bit about community-centered boards. That is the system that's set up in the state of Colorado. Again, if you come from another state, that system, government-funded system, will look different. But in Colorado, community-centered boards currently are a single point of entry. There are 20 of them in the state. They serve people by county. They receive Medicaid funds, so they are the government-funded system to provide services and supports for people with IDD. And there's the system and designed to provide support for children, and that's defined as birth through age 17, and adults who are considered 18 and older. Again, community center boards are the single entry point for everything for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. If they need transportation, if they need assistance with housing, if they need job support, if they need a job, those kinds of services and supports are provided through the CCD. I mentioned that there are 20 CCDs in the state. They serve geographic areas by county. Those areas are non-overlapping, so there's never really a conflict of who's serving whom in what county. And the community center boards currently, there's some talk about changing this at the legislature, but currently community center boards provide case management. Again, manage the resources that are determined to be, that an individual is determined to be eligible for. So if a person with intellectual and developmental disabilities presents as a victim of sexual assault in whatever capacity, wherever you are working with him or her, an important thing to know is that you alone are not the sole person who can help with services and supports for that person. You may be the expert in sexual assault, but there is an entire service delivery system that that person is probably involved with to help with all those ancillary things that oftentimes complicate our response to supporting victims of sexual assault. I mentioned a couple of those, for instance, housing, transportation, and so on. This is that map of community center boards. There is a web address there. I came up with that address by Googling Colorado Community Centered Boards. If you do that, you see not only this map, but those numbers that are within those colored areas corresponding to the name of the community-centered board that serves that particular geographic area, and contact information, web address for that CCD in particular, as well as a telephone number. I work for the ARC of Aurora, and it is through that employment that I'm eligible to be a regional specialist for CCASA, and our community-centered board is number 6 on this map, and that is developmental pathways. So clients that we work with in Aurora are served through developmental pathways. So this is, again, understanding community center boards is an important resource. Another resource for you beyond the community center boards is ARC chapters. I do work for the ARC of Aurora, and in Colorado, and again, this too may be different if you've come from a different state. In Colorado, the ARCs are advocates only. We do not provide direct services, meaning we do not get that government Medicaid money to provide services and supports. In many states, in fact most states, the ARC chapters are not advocacy only. They are also the service providers in addition to being advocacy, providing advocacy services. When the ARC was founded in Colorado many years ago, parents decided that it was a conflict of interest to be providing both the services and supports and being the advocates or checks and balances to that system. So ARCs in Colorado consequently are not service providers. We provide advocacy only. So ARC chapters too are another resource for you in addition to community center boards in working with and trying to provide services and supports for a victim of sexual assault who has an IDD. ARC chapters are privately funded. The majority of our funding comes from the ARC thrift stores. We are different from the art thrift stores in that we have our own 501c3 status, we have our own missions, we have our own boards of directors, etc. The ARC thrift stores profit, if you will, and thus why they are able to be a nonprofit, is to provide funding for our advocacy work. So I like to tell people that we're cousins. Most of us receive our primary funding from ARC thrift stores, but we are separate from the thrift stores. There are 11 ARC chapters currently in the state of Colorado. I understand there's talk about a 12th one down in the Four Corners area. But there is a link here. But if you, again, you Google ARC chapters in Colorado, you will come up with not just the ARC in Colorado, but the other 10 individual chapters. It's important to recognize that we too are, if you will, geographic in nature. For instance, the ARC of Aurora serves the city of Aurora. It's a little bit different. Most of the other ARC chapters serve counties. We serve the city of Aurora, which is in Adams County as well as Arapahoe County. But again, if you have questions on an ARC chapter or a contact at an ARC chapter, that too is something that I would be happy to help you with. I'm getting ready to close here and look to see if any of you have questions. But before I do, I just kind of want to reiterate, we are all on this call because in some capacity we work with victims of sexual assault. And I want to reiterate that the best practices for doing so for people with disabilities are the same as they are for all victims and survivors of sexual assault. And that is first to support them, secondly to help them with information, and thirdly to help them with referral. And hopefully it is by understanding intellectual developmental disabilities, understanding how folks are targeted, understanding the accommodations and considerations we can make as individuals communicating with victims with IDD, as well as kind of the culture of our organizations, both physically and from like an intake process and so on. And then knowing what resources, both the community center boards and ARC chapters exist really to help us help those survivors. I think we're able to provide that support, information, and referral. So as we look to begin to conclude here, I do have a fourth poll that I'd like to ask you to participate in, and that is considering the information that we went over in extremely cursory fashion today, but looking to address that, begin to have us think about the intersection of disability and sexual assault. What other trainings will you attend related to the intersection of disability and sexual assault? And I've got several choices there. And those are, your response to this particular poll is helpful. It would help CCASA, help Alexa and I specifically in looking at possible future webinars. It will help me in perhaps outreaching to you specifically or encouraging you to outreach to me to help your organizations accommodate this. So I see some folks think that they could use some help with making their organization more client with a disability friendly. About the same number, half, are interested in some help on communicating. And there's a lot more information we can talk about with that. We can do some role play, we can set up some scenarios, etc. Information on resources, the CCBs in our chapters, better understanding vulnerability, folks are interested in, and just basically, too, half of you are interested in some information on intellectual and developmental disabilities. Perfect. Thank you so much. Still some folks responding. I think so if we could, for now, maybe close that poll and move to questions. We can look and see what questions folks may have. And go ahead, if you do have questions, feel free to type those in the chat box. Yes, one question, difference of mental retardation. I maybe alluded to the fact mental retardation is a term we used to use to describe a intellectual disability, and it's really not being used. In fact, you see at the legislative level and in the executive branch eliminating that particular term. And so mental retardation is really used to even be a diagnostic term and not so much anymore. Good question. There's somebody noted that I have been talking about people with disabilities. Good point. Thank you. It's important to recognize all victims, as we all do, appreciate dignity and respect. People with intellectual and developmental disabilities prefer to be known as people first. They're people with a disability rather than a disabled person. So that's referred to as people first language. And thank you. Yes, you do see that I am using people first language, and that's one way that your organization, a very simple way, can begin to become disability friendly and accommodate people with disabilities is by a conscious effort to use people first language. Somebody is asking about sharing the PowerPoint. Yes, I will be getting that to Alexa shortly after the webinar, so she can send it out to all of us who have attended this afternoon so that you can share with your colleagues. Again, if I'd like to reiterate that I'm available to come if you have colleagues who are interested in a brown bag session, you have staff training. I'm very flexible and available to come to those trainings, and to that end have a last slide that provides my contact information, both email as well as my cell phone number. I'm happy to work with you on information, referral, presentations. We can define educational objectives and so on. I look forward to doing so and appreciate your attendance today. We'll look at if additional questions come in while we have yet a few minutes. I will work at getting you that particular information. I think Alexa will talk about certificate of attendance, and so as a result, I will sign off and turn this over to Alexa so she can address that information. Thanks, Alexa. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Jean. I really appreciate it. I know when I first heard Jean give a similar presentation, I was really surprised about things I hadn't heard about, like the community-centered boards, some of the different acronyms that you need to know as a service provider working with survivors with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So thank you so much for sharing that information. As we wrap up today, I just want to let you know about our April webinar. It'll be on April 15th, and we're going to be talking about outreach to survivors in the jails. And we have a model program down in Durango, Colorado, from the organization called SASO, S-A-S-O, down there, and they are doing work directly with survivors in the jails and doing some amazing things that I'm sure you'll want to hear about, something that you could easily replicate in your community. So that will be April 15th, and you can go to our website and register for that. It's another free webinar. I also want to remind people that Sexual Assault Awareness Month is rapidly approaching. So as you'll see here, if you can see my video beside me, we have a kickoff at the Capitol. Our SAM kickoff at the Capitol takes place on Thursday, April 2nd from 12 to 1 p.m. at the old Supreme Court chambers in the Capitol building itself. So no registration necessary. You can just come on down. There'll be refreshments and speakers and performances and a great event just to kick off the month of April. Another thing that we have during April, make sure you get my postcards right beside me, is our Colorado Denim Day. It's a signature fundraising event for CCASA where we do encourage you to sign up to participate by wearing jeans and making a small donation of $5 to show your support and help raise awareness about sexual violence in our communities. So a couple things going on in April. Denim Day is April 29th this year. There's also a lot of other events. Our members are adding their Sexual Assault Awareness Month events to our calendar. You just click under Go to an Event and click Submit an Event if you want to add yours, or just click on Go to an Event and you can view the calendar and see what's going on in communities across Colorado. So thank you so much to Jean. I do encourage you to check out more information about our Regional Training and Assistance Program and how Jean can help, as well as our other regional specialists. And hope to see you at some events around the state during April for Sexual Assault Awareness Month. So be in touch if you have any questions about certificates or anything like that. You can just respond to the follow-up email to this webinar. Thanks, everybody. It looks like there are no other questions. I'll go ahead and end the webinar for today and hope you have a good afternoon.